the moment you've been waiting for. Screencast 14, the last one in our Anatomical Kinesiology course. So today we're going to take a look at motion analysis in the lower extremities. In Screencast 13 we looked at the upper extremities. So we're going to flip that around and take a look at how this might be of benefit to us when we look at things that we tend to do from the mid down. So our goals for today, to take a look at some of the conditioning principles that govern how we work with lower extremity dominant sport skills. We'll revisit this idea of the kinetic chain, take a look at exercise analysis and prescription, and hopefully apply some of that knowledge you've been gathering over the course of the semester. So first things first, when we look at what specific sports require us to do, it's critical that we don't just look at the metabolic specificity or the actual movements that are occurring, but muscularly, what's going on? Is that a skill that is requiring us to produce movement, in which case we're functioning concentrically? Is it a skill that requires us to control motion, where we're working eccentrically, or to maintain our position, as we see in isometric activities? So for example, a javelin thrower or a shot putter, their performance is going to depend heavily not just on upper extremity concentric action, but on lower extremity concentric action as well. Javelin thrower is going to have a run approach, and they're going to need to plant and use their hips. By the same token, shot putter is going to have to use their hips to generate as much force as possible, and that's concentric. That's producing force. The force that the muscles is producing is greater than the resistance greater than the resistance that they'll be encountering. Now, on the other hand, eccentric strength may be necessary for something like an offensive lineman who's in pass blocking, and he's trying to prevent that defensive lineman from getting to his quarterback. So he's got to control that motion. Or when we land from a jump, like in basketball, pulling down a rebound, we've got to be able to use the muscles eccentrically. Okay. Now, in any kind of training, we understand that our body likes homeostasis. And homeostasis is that status at which things remain unchanged. Okay. So in order to elicit positive adaptations from training, we have to constantly upset homeostasis. So we do that by varying different aspects of the training stimulus. That could be frequency, how often, how many times per week, or how many times within a microcycle are we exposing the body to a specific type of lift. Intensity, usually in resistance training, that's measured as a percentage of the 1 rep maximum, but there are certainly other ways that we can quantify intensity. And then duration is going to basically dictate how long we're under tension and how much time we are spending in a specific type of exercise. The said principle that we've discussed previously this semester, specific adaptation to impose demands, means if I want to trigger an adaptation, then my training stimulus needs to reflect that. Okay, so if I want to be a better high jumper, then I don't spend my time broad jumping the entire time. Okay, so whether that's metabolic specificity, whether that's neurologic specificity, whether that is concentric, eccentric, muscular action specificity, I want to train the athlete in the way that they're going to have to perform. Put another way, the test is the exercise, and the exercise is the test. So if I'm high jumping, I'm going to do exercises that closely mimic or replicate high jumping. Okay? So functional training is kind of the recent adaptation. In the past couple of decades, we talked a lot about sport-specific training, and now we don't talk about that as much. We talk about functional training, and we want that exercise prescription to be related. Okay? In order to be a high jumper, I don't have to just do high jumping. There are related things, and that's where functional training can come in. And a lot of times, the benefit and the beauty of functional training is that I assess movement in terms of planes and axes that we've already learned about. Okay, we have a tendency to overlook transverse plane or rotational type exercises. If I bench press, I squat, I deadlift, that's all primarily sagittal plane. Okay? And I'm not doing much rotationally in a transverse plane. Yet when I get out into competition, if I'm shooting a basketball or throwing a baseball or doing all these other things, oftentimes there's a rotational component to it. So functional training says I'm going to approach training in a way that's reflective of what I'm going to do on the court or on the field. Now with energy system specificity, I'm going to prescribe my exercise in a way that stresses the system in the same way that gameplay would. Okay. So in football, we know most plays are going to last 20 seconds or less. Most rest intervals are going to be 40 seconds or more. So that's a real common prescription for intervals. If I'm doing lower extremity exercise, instead of having athletes do 3 sets of 10, I may give them 20 seconds to do as many reps as they can. Just like in football, where they're playing as hard as they can for 20 seconds, and then there's a 40-second rest interval. So by prescribing the exercise in a way that's reflective of what's done on the court or on the field, I get that additional benefit of metabolic adaptations to training, not just structural, cross-sectional area, or neurological motor control. Okay, so last time we talked about the kinetic chain. So in lower extremity exercises, most of the time, functional kinetic chain exercises are closed in nature. So if I'm doing a squat or a lunge, that's a closed kinetic chain exercise. If the distalmost link is free to move, the foot's in the air, or the hand's grasping a free weight, then that chain is considered to be open. All right, so when we look at the lower extremity, something like this where the patient is standing on an unstable surface, so she's on a half foam roller, and the clinician is tossing a medicine ball or a sport ball to her, requires a little bit more proprioception, some balance ability, but it's a perfect example of a closed kinetic chain exercise. So that extremity is fixed. It provides the patient with a little bit more control, or the athlete in this case. And so oftentimes we'll use this early in rehab so that we're protecting that healing injury from further damage. So we have that added control. Now, lots of times our closed kinetic chain exercises may or may not be really sport specific. We really adhere strictly to closed kinetic chain. Something like a jump or even running has an open kinetic chain component to it. So as we progress, we'll usually stray away from strictly fixed closed kinetic chain exercises. So we might start with a squat, but eventually we're going to progress to something like a jump squat or a scissor jump or something along those lines. Open kinetic chain exercises, on the other hand, that extremity is free to move in space. There's less control, and potentially there's more damage to support structures or ligaments in some cases. So something like a hamstring curl or a knee extension on a machine is going to introduce torque. It's going to introduce some added forces that we don't necessarily want in that healing tissue. But we don't want to completely avoid these exercises, because later in rehab it's going to be important that we load that joint in all the ways that it could potentially be loaded. So it is useful. It may involve some decrease in overall control, but it does represent more of what we do in sports. So something like a box jump or a depth jump might be an example. All right, so if we want to do an exercise or a video analysis, we start simply by watching that exercise, that movement that's being performed, and then we describe joint by joint what's going on in terms of flexion and extension, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion at the ankle. And then we'll logically divide that movement into its component phases. And then we can recognize, okay, the quadricep is functioning concentrically here to produce force, or the hamstring is functioning eccentrically to control force. And so that's going to allow us to better understand when form suffers, what's the likely culprit? Okay, which muscles aren't doing their job, or which muscles are doing their job ineffectively. So if we look at something like a squat, we'd first of all describe that movement. So we've got a descent phase. It's going to be eccentric. We're controlling motion, not just collapsing to the ground. That trunk is going to be in neutral. We are going to push the hips back like we're trying to open a door with our rear end. So the hips are going to flex. Then next, the knees are going to flex. We don't want to lead that with knee flexion. The knees will go over the toes if we do that. So the hip flexion predominates. Okay, so this is a hip hinge exercise. And then the ascent phase is just the opposite. The trunk's going to stay in neutral with slight extension. We want to hollow the lumbar spine, not hollow the belly. So we're not kyphotic. We're in good posture. And then we're going to extend the hips and subsequently extend the knees and plantar flex the ankle. Okay. So if we look at muscularly what's going on there, once we've described the motion, then we look at, okay, which muscles are controlling that, okay? So in that descent phase, the trunk being held in neutral with slight extension, that's going to be our rectus abdominis and then our transversus abdominis. There are other muscles that are involved here, certainly, but these are largely going to be isometric with some eccentric, not a lot of motion here. We're trying to stabilize the core. And then that hip flexion is occurring eccentrically. We've got the posterior musculature that's controlling that hip flexion. And then anteriorly, we've got concentric action with the iliopsoas, the sartorius, and the rectus femoris. Okay. The knee flexion, same thing. Okay. We realize that the biceps are the hamstrings are producing that action. So semitendinosus, semimembranosus, biceps femoris, and even the gastroc. So if you notice here, gastroc is listed twice. It's concentric for knee flexion and eccentric for ankle dorsiflexion. And then if you look at the hamstrings, eccentric for hip flexion, concentric for knee flexion. We talked about this concept of a concurrent shift. So even though our hips are flexing and our knees are flexing, hip flexion should put the hamstrings on stretch, knee flexion should put the hamstrings on slack, so we end up not necessarily changing the origin and insertion's relationship to one another. So that's how that can occur. Okay, on the ascent phase, pretty much just the opposite. Okay, a lot of concentric action occurring here because it's a concentric phase. The eccentric component really is just to control that motion, make sure we keep our balance. Okay, so what I'd like you to do, this is on the honor system, not going to grade you on this, is pick one of these following exercises and analyze it. Look at the segments step by step, then divide it into its component phases, piece by piece, and then for each of those phases, divide those into eccentric and concentric contributions to musculature. And I think what you'll find is that you might have memorized some flashcards or origin, insertion, action, innervation for muscles, but your ability to apply it really takes your knowledge to another level, and it makes it such that it's more than just memorized facts. This is actual human movement, kinesiology in action. Okay, for exercise prescription, first of all, we've got to identify the weakness. So that motion analysis is key. I want to be able to look at that activity first, and then I want to, by segment, by phase, be able to identify what needs to be addressed. Once I've identified that weakness, I want to figure out which exercises can best address it. And hopefully those are going to be functional, and they're going to be intended to have the muscles train and work synergistically. But there are instances where I'm going to train in isolation. Okay, that's not ideal for a bodybuilder. Absolutely, I want to train my bicep in isolation because I want to maximize cross-sectional area. That's not ideal for performance, though. I want functional exercises so that bicep is not just maximally hypertrophied, but it also works in appropriate sequence at the appropriate time, along with the muscles of the upper extremity in this instance. Okay, so I analyze that motion prior to prescription. I identify those concentric prime movers and those eccentric prime movers. That, my friends, is it. You have made it. So congratulations. It's been a fun ride. It's been my honor and my privilege to be your instructor this semester, and I'm looking forward to possibly having you again in some of the other offerings. Stay tuned. You can subscribe to my channel. I'll be posting free content all the time, and if this was of interest to you, share it. Okay. Always happy to answer questions that you might have. So my email and my phone number can be found in the syllabus, or contact me on my website, and I'll be happy to assist you in any way. Thanks a lot. Good luck on the rest of your journey, and never stop getting better. This is Brooks out.